It was late evening inside the Grand City Concert Hall. The golden lights were dim, and most of the musicians had already gone home. Only one man stayed behind, the janitor, Samuel. He moved quietly across the marble floor, pushing his mop in slow, gentle strokes. The sound of the wet mop echoed in the silence like soft music. He worked carefully, making sure every corner shined before the next day's rehearsal. He was the kind of man who never complained, never argued, and always smiled when someone passed by. But most of the time, no one noticed him. Samuel was in his 50s, his back a little bent from years of hard work, his hands rough and tired, yet when he moved, there was grace in his steps, as if rhythm lived inside him sometimes. As he cleaned around the orchestra stage, he would pause, look at the conductor's stand, and smile softly. It was more than just a stage to him. It was a memory of a life that could have been. Years ago, Samuel had been different. He had dreams like fire in his heart. He had once studied music, learning how to read notes, how to move the baton, how to guide an orchestra to create something beautiful. He used to believe that one day he would stand on a stage and lead hundreds of musicians, but life had other plans. When his wife fell sick, he left his studies to work full-time. He took any job he could find, cleaning, repairing, sweeping, anything to pay for her medicine. She passed away years later, leaving behind only an old violin and the sound of silence. After that, Samuel stopped dreaming. He needed money, so he took the janitor job at the concert hall. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was a place filled with music, and that was enough to keep him breathing. Every night after everyone left, he would sweep the stage, wipe the chairs, and hum the same gentle melody his wife once loved. The sound of his voice was soft, cracked with age, but full of feeling. During rehearsals, Samuel often stood in the back, pretending to fix things just so he could listen. He watched how the conductor moved his hands, how the violinists lifted their bows at the perfect second, how the sound grew and swelled like a wave. He felt every note as if it were a heartbeat. Sometimes he would close his eyes and imagine himself there, in the center and leading them, his hands moving with power and passion, the orchestra following his rhythm. But then a voice would break his daydream. "Hey, janitor, can you clean the side door?" And he would nod quietly, returning to his mop. The musicians hardly knew his name to them. He was just the janitor. Some were kind enough to say hello. Others ignored him completely. They laughed and talked about music, fame, and concerts in faraway cities. Samuel listened, smiled, and swept the floor under their feet. He never told them that he understood every musical term they used, that he knew every symphony they played by heart. He kept that secret like a small flame in his chest. One cold winter evening, Samuel stood alone after a long rehearsal. He watched the chairs lined up in neat rows, the instruments covered in soft cloths. The silence felt heavy. He picked up a broken piece of baton that someone had left behind and held it in his hand. It felt familiar. He raised it slightly, hesitating, then moved his arm gently, as if conducting an invisible orchestra. His movements were slow but filled with emotion. The air around him felt alive for a few minutes. Samuel forgot who he was. He forgot the mop, the uniform, the laughter, and the loneliness. He was not a janitor anymore. He was the conductor he had always wanted to be. He waved his hand, guiding the air, feeling the rhythm that lived deep inside him. In his mind, the violins played softly. The cellos hummed, the trumpets soared. He could almost hear his wife's laughter from the first row, proud and happy. Then the stage lights flickered. Breaking his moment, he sighed and placed the broken baton back on the stand, quietly returning to his mop. Yet a small smile stayed on his lips, because for a moment he had touched his dream again. The next morning, when the musicians returned, Samuel was already there, polishing the floor. One of the young violinists accidentally dropped her sheet music. Samuel picked it up and handed it to her, smiling. "You play beautifully," he said softly. She looked surprised. "Oh, thank you," she replied politely and walked away. She didn't know that the janitor who cleaned her stage could hear the smallest mistake in her rhythm. Every night after that, Samuel continued his quiet routine, sweeping, humming, remembering. He didn't have a stage or an audience, but he still had music in his soul, and that was enough for now. He didn't know that life was preparing a surprise for him, a moment when the world would finally hear the music he had carried inside all along. The grand concert hall shined as always, filled with laughter, gossip, and the sound of violins tuning in the distance. But in one corner, Samuel worked quietly with his mop and bucket, his heart beating to a rhythm only he could hear. No one knew that behind that old janitor's tired eyes lived the spirit of a true musician, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The next morning, the concert hall buzzed with energy. The orchestra was rehearsing for an upcoming event. Musicians tuned their violins, the cellists tested their strings, and the conductor, Leonard, stood tall at the front, waving his baton like a king commanding his court. Samuel moved quietly along the side of the stage, carrying his broom and bucket, his head lowered. He had been cleaning that same hall for 10 years, and he knew every corner, every light that flickered, and every note that echoed. Leonard was new, young, confident, and full of pride. He had graduated from a top music academy and walked with the air of someone who thought he was untouchable. He noticed Samuel sweeping near the stage and frowned slightly. "Hey, make sure you don't make noise during rehearsal," he said sharply. Samuel nodded politely. "Of course, sir," he replied with his usual calm smile. As the orchestra began to play, the hall filled with music. Samuel paused for a moment, leaning on his broom, and closed his eyes to feel the rhythm. His hand moved slightly, following the invisible beat. He didn't even realize it. His body just reacted naturally, like he was part of the song itself. The violin soared, the drums thundered, and Samuel's hand waved through the air with such grace that, for a second, he forgot he was holding a broom. But then Leonard's voice broke through the music. "Stop! Stop! Who's moving back there?" he shouted. The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to the corner. Samuel froze, his face turning red. "Oh, it's the janitor," Leonard said with a smirk. "Were you trying to conduct my orchestra?" A few musicians laughed softly, others looked away awkwardly. Samuel smiled weakly. "No, sir, I was just—" But Leonard cut him off. "Just sweeping, right? Stick to that," he said coldly. "We don't need another conductor here." His words hit like a slap. Samuel lowered his head and quietly went back to sweeping, pretending not to care, but deep inside something twisted painfully. He had heard laughter before, from people who thought dreams were only for the rich and talented. He had been called many things in life, and poor, unlucky, invisible, but this moment stung more than any of them, because it happened in the place he loved most, surrounded by the music that had once been his everything. When rehearsal ended, Leonard left with his usual confident stride, laughing with the musicians. Samuel stayed behind, wiping the stage slowly. The broom glided across the floor as his eyes lingered on the empty conductor's stand. For a moment, he saw himself there, years ago. Younger, full of hope, leading an orchestra of his own. He sighed, placing the broom aside, when suddenly, a soft voice came from behind him. "You really were following the music, weren't you?" It was Clara, the violinist, one of the youngest members of the orchestra. She had stayed behind to fix her violin case. Her tone was kind, curious, not mocking. Samuel smiled gently. "Old habits," he said. "I used to study music a long time ago." "Before life took me elsewhere," Clara tilted her head, surprised. "You studied music?" she asked. "Yes," Samuel nodded. "Conducting, actually, but I had to stop. Life doesn't always go the way we plan." He chuckled softly, trying to make light of it. Clara looked at him thoughtfully. "You moved your hands perfectly with the beat," she said. "Most people wouldn't even notice the tempo changes." Samuel looked down. Embarrassed? "I guess it never left me," he murmured. "Music is something you don't forget. It stays in your blood," Clara smiled and said quietly. "I think you should show them." "One day," Samuel laughed softly. "Show them?" "I'm just a janitor now," he said. "People don't expect music from men with mops." Clara shook her head. "Maybe that's why it would surprise them," she said with a spark in her eyes. He didn't know what to say. No one had ever spoken to him like that in years. Her words stayed in his mind even after she left. That night, when the hall was empty again, Samuel stood once more at the center of the stage, the broken baton he had found earlier still resting on the conductor's stand. He picked it up. The cool wood felt alive in his fingers. He took a deep breath and lifted his arm. His other hand rose slightly, and for a moment he forgot where he was. The silence of the empty hall transformed into a grand symphony inside his head. He could hear every section, the violins weaving softly, the flutes whispering like wind, the drums thundering like distant rain. His hands moved with passion, precision and emotion unbeknownst to him. Clara had returned to pick up a forgotten scarf. She stood at the door, frozen in awe, watching Samuel conduct the air with a grace she had never seen even in professional maestros. There was something raw and powerful in his movements, something that came from deep within his soul. When Samuel finally stopped breathing heavily, He noticed her standing there, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said quickly, embarrassed. "I didn't know anyone was here." Clara stepped closer, her voice soft. "Don't apologize," she said. "That was beautiful." He smiled faintly. "It's just an old man's memory," he said. "Nothing more." But Clara shook her head. "It's more than that," she whispered. "You have something rare, something most of us lost chasing perfection." Samuel didn't know how to respond. Her words filled the air with warmth he hadn't felt in years. As she left, she turned and said, "Promise me you won't stop." And he stood there for a long time after she was gone, holding the baton like a piece of his past had just come back to life. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. Her words replayed in his head. "You should show them." He looked at his hands. The same hands that cleaned floors. The same hands that once dreamed of leading music. Maybe he couldn't change the world, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could still remind it that greatness can come from anywhere, even from the hands of a janitor. The next few days passed quietly, but something inside Samuel had changed. Every time he walked through the concert hall, his eyes drifted toward the conductor's stand. His fingers twitched slightly when he heard the orchestra play. Clara's words still echoed in his mind. "You should show them." It sounded simple, but it carried a strange power. He didn't know if it was encouragement or temptation, yet it stirred something long buried in his soul. During breaks, he sometimes found himself humming softly as he mopped the marble floor. His movements matched the rhythm of the music drifting from the practice room. The janitor uniform didn't hide his grace. His body swayed gently as if he were still conducting in his heart. And though most people didn't notice, Clara did. She watched him quietly between rehearsals, curious and amazed. One evening, after the musicians had packed their instruments and left, Clara stayed behind. She approached Samuel as he stacked chairs. "Mr. Samuel," she said softly, "would you show me something?" He looked surprised. "Show you what?" he asked. "How you conduct," she said, smiling. "I've been thinking about that night, the way you moved. It wasn't just skill, it was real." Samuel chuckled nervously. "That was just me fooling around," he said. "I'm a janitor, remember?" But Clara shook her head. "No, you're not," she said firmly. "You just happen to clean floors right now. But you have something that conductor doesn't. You feel the music." Her words hit him like a soft but powerful wave. He hesitated, unsure, but finally nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "but promise me, no one else should know." She smiled. "It'll be our secret." That night, the grand concert hall was empty, silent except for the distant sound of wind brushing the windows. Clara placed her violin on her shoulder and nodded. Samuel stood in the center of the stage, holding the broken baton he'd kept hidden in his locker. His hands trembled slightly, but when he lifted his arm, all fear disappeared. He moved slowly at first, guiding Clara through a simple melody, but within seconds the air around them began to change. The sound of her violin filled the room. Delicate and alive, Samuel's hands floated gracefully, each motion painting invisible shapes in the air. His eyes glowed with focus and passion. Clara followed every movement with awe, feeling the music bloom like light for a few minutes. It didn't matter who he was or what uniform he wore. The stage, the music, the sound, it all belonged to him again. When they finished, Clara lowered her violin, tears glistening in her eyes. "That was beautiful," she whispered. Samuel smiled softly. "It's been years since I've done that," he said. "I forgot how it feels to breathe through music." After that night, they began to meet secretly every evening after work. Clara would bring her violin. Sometimes a few others joined quietly. A cellist, a flutist, a percussionist. All people who had heard whispers about the mysterious janitor who could conduct like a master. At first they came out of curiosity, but soon they stayed because of how Samuel made them feel. He didn't conduct like Leonard, who waved his arms like he was controlling machines. Samuel conducted like a storyteller. Every motion told a tale, every pause held emotion. His hands didn't just command sound, they invited it. Shaped it, gave it heart. He would stop and explain softly. "Listen to what the music is saying, not just what's written on the paper." And his words made sense in ways that no textbook ever had. The small group grew night by night. The janitor's secret rehearsals became something magical. Laughter filled the hall after hours. Music flowed freely. No one cared about titles or status. Under Samuel's invisible baton, they were equals. Musicians chasing the pure joy of sound. One night after a breathtaking session, Clara said, You have to let them see you perform. Samuel smiled sadly. They wouldn't believe a janitor could do what I do, he said. They'd laugh. Clara shook her head. Then let them laugh first, she said, and listen later. He didn't answer, but her confidence planted a seed in him as the days passed. More musicians began to notice the quiet change in Clara's playing. Her tone was richer, her timing sharper. Leonard praised her improvement but never guessed who was behind it. One evening he even joked, "Whatever you're doing, keep it up. Maybe have the janitor teach the others too." He laughed. Not knowing how close he was to the truth, Samuel pretended not to hear, sweeping the corner of the hall. But Clara caught his eye and smiled secretly, a silent promise that one day the truth would come out. Late one night as he finished cleaning, Samuel sat on the edge of the stage staring at the empty seats. He imagined them filled, hundreds of people, eyes shining, waiting for the first note. He imagined standing there again, not as a janitor but as himself, baton in hand, music flowing through his veins. He whispered softly, "Maybe just once more." His reflection stared back from the polished floor, tired but hopeful in his heart. He knew he couldn't hide forever. He didn't want fame or applause. He just wanted to share what he loved before time took it away. The secret rehearsals continued, stronger and bolder. Samuel taught them more complex pieces, and their sound grew powerful, like a secret symphony waiting to burst into the world. Sometimes he caught Clara watching him with quiet pride, and it made him stand taller, move freer, conduct with more soul. He had no idea that soon fate would hand him a chance he never asked for, a chance to stand in front of everyone who once laughed at him, to show them that greatness doesn't wear a suit or hold a title. It lives quietly, waiting to be heard even in the hands of a janitor with a broken baton. The nights inside the concert hall began to feel different now. The place that once echoed with cold silence after rehearsals was alive again, filled with secret melodies that only a few souls knew about. Every evening, after the lights dimmed and the last footsteps faded, Samuel would quietly lock the doors, waiting for Clara and the small group of musicians who trusted him. It started with just her violin, but now the little after-hours orchestra had grown, a flutist, a cellist, 2 violinists, and even a timid percussionist who sneaked in his drumsticks after hours. They called it the midnight practice, and half as a joke, half as a promise. It was their secret, hidden from the conductor, from the management, and from the world. Samuel didn't plan to be their leader, but somehow every night, the moment he lifted that broken baton, everything around him changed. His wrinkled face glowed with energy. His eyes burned with focus. The music followed him like it had been waiting for his touch. Clara often watched in awe as the janitor transformed into someone else entirely. His hands didn't command, they guided, they told stories. One evening, after a beautiful rehearsal of a Tchaikovsky piece, Clara put down her violin and said softly, "Mr. Samuel, the way you bring life into the notes, it's like you know what the composer was feeling." Samuel smiled gently. "Music isn't about notes," he said. "It's about understanding the silence between them." The group grew quiet. Even the young percussionist nodded. Those words stayed with them, and soon, everyone began playing differently, more emotionally, more honestly. Samuel never shouted or demanded perfection, yet somehow, perfection found them. But not everyone would stay silent forever. One night, as they finished their session, the hall door creaked open unexpectedly. Samuel froze, thinking it was Leonard or the hall manager. But to their surprise, it was David, one of the senior violinists. He stood there shocked. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. His eyes darted between Samuel, the musicians, and the instruments in their hands. Clara stepped forward nervously. "We were just—" But before she could finish, David interrupted. "Are you rehearsing without the conductor's permission?" he said, then looked at Samuel with disbelief. "And led by the janitor?" His tone was dripping with sarcasm. Samuel opened his mouth to explain, but Clara spoke first. "He's not just a janitor," she said firmly. "He's a musician, a real one. He's teaching us more than we've ever learned from Leonard." David scoffed. "Oh, please, this is ridiculous," he said. "Do you even hear yourselves?" He stormed out, muttering something about rules and career risks. The room fell silent. The small group looked at each other nervously. "He'll tell Leonard," the flutist whispered. Samuel sighed. "If he does, then it's all right," he said quietly. "We did nothing wrong. Music isn't a crime," but still that night his heart was heavy. He knew rumors spread faster than sound in places like this, and sure enough, by the next morning, whispers ran through the orchestra like wildfire. People were talking about the janitor maestro. Some laughed. Others were curious. Leonard, however, was furious. He confronted Clara before rehearsal, his tone sharp. "Is it true?" he asked, "that you've been taking lessons from the janitor?" Clara didn't deny it. "Yes," she said bravely, "and you should hear him. He's better than you think." Leonard's face turned red. "Better than me?" he snapped. "He cleans floors, for heaven's sake." That day's rehearsal was tense. Leonard's movements were stiff. The orchestra felt disconnected. Even the music sounded hollow. Samuel kept to the side, pretending not to hear the whispers or the occasional mocking glances. Yet inside he wasn't angry, only sad. He had never wanted to embarrass anyone. He just wanted to share what he loved that evening. He almost didn't stay back for their secret practice. He sat in the janitor's room staring at his mop and gloves, wondering if it was time to stop, but then there was a knock on the door. Clara stood there with her violin case. "They're waiting for you," she said simply. Samuel hesitated. "Maybe it's better if we don't continue," he said softly. "The conductor is angry, the management might—" But Clara cut him off. "Let them be angry," she said firmly. "Music doesn't belong to ranks or titles. It belongs to those who feel it." Her words made him smile again, and together they walked back into the hall. That night the music was more powerful than ever. Every note carried emotion, defiance, pride, and hope. It wasn't just practice anymore, it was expression, a voice for those who were unheard. As Samuel raised his baton, he didn't think about Leonard or the gossip. He thought about why he had loved music in the first place. It wasn't for fame or applause. It was for the beauty of harmony, of people coming together to create something that could touch hearts. The orchestra played like never before. The cellist's bow danced across the strings. The flutist's melody soared, and Clara's violin cried like a song of freedom. Samuel moved with them, his arms guiding, shaping, breathing life into sound. The hall once again came alive under his invisible magic. When the music ended, the musicians stood in silence. No one spoke for a long moment. Then the young percussionist whispered, "That felt real." Samuel smiled warmly. "That's what music is supposed to feel like," he said. From that night on, they weren't just a group hiding from the world. They were a family, bonded by sound and secrecy. And even though the storm outside was growing, none of them wanted to stop, because deep down, they all knew they were part of something extraordinary, something the world would one day hear. And in the quiet corners of his heart, Samuel began to believe again that maybe dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment and the right people to bring them back to life. The concert hall was busier than ever. Banners were being hung, tickets were selling fast, and everyone was talking about the upcoming Grand Charity Gala. It was the most important event of the year. Famous critics, wealthy sponsors, and even the city mayor would be there. For Leonard, the conductor, this was his big chance to impress the world. For Samuel, it was just another night of cleaning floors and polishing chairs, or so everyone thought. But beneath the polished marble and bright chandeliers, something else was happening: tension. The orchestra had been struggling. The rehearsals were messy, and the musicians whispered among themselves that Leonard's grand vision wasn't working. His conducting felt rushed, his temper sharp, his pride even sharper. The more he tried to control the music, the less it came alive. Samuel could feel it too. Every evening as he cleaned, he watched them argue over timing, expression, and balance. He heard the frustration in their voices. He knew what was missing: emotion, connection, heart. Yet he stayed silent, sweeping the corner quietly as always. One afternoon, as rehearsal ended in chaos, Leonard threw down his baton. "Why can't you people follow rhythm?" he snapped. "You sound like you're all playing different pieces." The room went silent. No one dared to speak. Samuel, who had been mopping near the back, looked up but said nothing. Leonard's glare shifted toward him. "And you," he said mockingly. "Maybe you should teach them, since you seem to know everything." A few musicians lowered their eyes to hide their smiles. Leonard was still bitter about the rumors, the janitor maestro, as people whispered. But Samuel didn't react. He simply nodded and said quietly, "Music isn't about control, sir, it's about trust." The room froze. No one had ever spoken to Leonard like that for a moment. Even the proud conductor had no reply. That night, in the janitor's small storage room, Clara came to see him. her face glowing with excitement. "Mr. Samuel," she said, "the orchestra's falling apart. Leonard can't get it right, and the gala is in a week." Samuel looked up from his cleaning bucket. "That's not my problem anymore," he said softly. "I'm not part of the orchestra." But Clara shook her head. "You are, whether they admit it or not, you are." She leaned forward, her voice trembling slightly. "Let me talk to the manager. Maybe we can find a way for you to help. Just one rehearsal. Secretly, if needed." Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "Clara, no one wants to see a janitor waving a baton. They'll laugh before I raise my hand." But Clara's eyes didn't waver. "Then let them laugh," she said firmly. "Because when they hear you—" They'll stop. The next day, the manager, a tired man named Mr. Hughes, called a private meeting with Leonard and a few senior musicians. The gala was too close, and everyone knew they weren't ready. Leonard blamed the players. The players blamed Leonard. Finally, Clara spoke up. "There is someone who can help," she said. Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Who? A miracle worker?" he said sarcastically. "No," she said calmly. "A janitor." The room erupted in laughter, but Clara didn't back down. "You all heard him play," she continued. "He understands the music, he feels it. And he made us sound better than we ever have," Leonard scoffed. "You can't be serious," but Mr. Hughes looked thoughtful. "At this point," he said, "I'll try anything." So it was decided, secretly, and against Leonard's will, that Samuel would lead one small piece during the next rehearsal. Just to see if he could bring the orchestra together? Leonard agreed only because he thought it would prove how ridiculous the idea was. The following evening, Samuel stood on the stage again, this time not alone. But in front of the full orchestra, dozens of eyes watched him with mixed expressions. Doubt, curiosity, some even with quiet respect. Leonard leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking. "All right, janitor," he said coldly. "Let's see your magic." Samuel took a slow breath. His heart pounding, he looked at the faces before him, not as musicians but as people. Tired, frustrated, disconnected. He lifted his baton, not the broken one but a real one Clara had secretly given him, and said gently, "Don't think about the notes, just think about what they mean." Then, he gave the first cue. The room filled with sound, but it wasn't the same confused noise as before, it was alive. Every section moved together like a single heartbeat. Samuel's hands moved with confidence and grace, guiding them through waves of emotion. He didn't shout or command, he simply breathed with the music, and they followed. Within minutes, the orchestra sounded transformed. The strings wept, the brass glowed, the percussion pulsed like thunder beneath their feet. When the final note faded, there was silence, a silence that hummed with awe. No one moved. Leonard's smirk had vanished. Mr. Hughes stared in disbelief. Then slowly one musician began to clap, then another. Soon the entire orchestra was applauding, not out of pity but out of pure admiration. Samuel lowered his baton, his eyes wet with emotion. "You see," he said softly, "the music was always inside you. I just reminded you how to listen." After that, no one laughed anymore. Leonard said nothing, his pride bruised but his silence louder than any insult. That night the manager made a bold decision. "Samuel will conduct one piece at the gala," he said firmly. "It's time people see what real passion looks like." Samuel tried to refuse. "I can't," he said. "I'm not worthy of a stage," but Clara placed her hand on his shoulder, smiling. "You already own it," she said. "You just don't know it yet." As he walked home under the city lights that night, Samuel looked up at the stars and felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The janitor who once swept dreams into corners was now being asked to bring them to life. He knew the road ahead would be hard, but deep in his heart he whispered, "Maybe this time, I'll finish the song I started long ago." The night of the grand charity gala arrived like a storm of lights. Whispers and polished shoes outside the concert hall. A red carpet stretched under the glow of chandeliers. Cars lined up, and the city's most important people stepped out dressed in diamonds and silk. Photographers clicked endlessly. Reporters whispered about the grand orchestra that was said to restore the magic of classical music. None of them knew that the man who would soon hold the baton was not a famous maestro, but the janitor who mopped the stage every night. Inside the hall, everything shimmered with perfection. Golden balconies, velvet seats, and the faint scent of roses filled the air. The musicians tuned their instruments nervously, their hands trembling slightly backstage. Samuel stood quietly near the curtain, wearing a borrowed black tuxedo. It fit awkwardly on his shoulders, but his eyes shone with calm fire. Clara stood beside him, her violin in hand. She gave him a reassuring smile. "They're waiting for you," she whispered. Samuel took a deep breath. "I've waited my whole life for this," he said softly, his voice shaking slightly. "And I never thought it would happen this way." Clara squeezed his arm. "You earned it," she said. "Now show them who you really are." On the other side of the curtain, Leonard stood before the orchestra, his face pale and tense. The gala had already begun. The audience applauded politely after the first two performances, but everyone was waiting for the final piece, the one that Leonard had reluctantly agreed to let Samuel conduct. He had spent the entire evening hoping something would go wrong so he could take back control, but deep down, he was afraid of what would happen if it went right. When Mr. Hughes, the manager, walked onto the stage to introduce the next act, his voice carried a hint of excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "for our closing performance, we bring you something truly special, an interpretation that reminds us music lives in every soul. No matter the title or uniform, please welcome Mr. Samuel Reed." For a moment, silence filled the hall. The audience looked confused. A few people whispered, "Who? The janitor? Is this some kind of joke?" Even some of the musicians exchanged uncertain glances. Leonard's smirk returned for a brief second, until Samuel stepped out, calm and composed, his presence surprisingly dignified. He walked to the center of the stage, each step slow but sure. His heart pounded, but his face stayed steady. He bowed politely to the audience, then turned toward the orchestra. The musicians straightened in their seats. The moment he raised the baton, the hall fell silent, the lights dimmed, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The first note rose like dawn breaking through darkness, soft and fragile, then spreading with warmth. Samuel's hands moved with quiet grace, guiding the violins to sing gently, the cellos to hum beneath them. His movements weren't grand or showy. They were delicate, precise, filled with emotion. Every gesture seemed to breathe life into the notes. Soon the sound began to grow, the music swelled with power. The trumpets cried like sunlight bursting through clouds. The flutes danced like wind, and the drums thundered deep and proud. Samuel's eyes shone as he led them. His body moved as if he and the music were one being. He wasn't just conducting. He was speaking through sound, telling his story without a single word. In the audience, people leaned forward, forgetting to blink. The laughter and whispers from earlier had vanished. Even Leonard, watching from the side, felt his chest tighten. The man he had mocked now stood in full command of the hall, shaping sound like an artist painting with air. The orchestra played with unity and passion they hadn't felt in years. It was as if Samuel had reached inside each of them and lit a fire they didn't know was still there. Clara's violin soared in the air like a cry of joy, her bow trembling with emotion. Tears gathered in her eyes. She had never felt so alive. The other musicians followed her energy, smiling through their exhaustion. They weren't playing for the crowd or the critics anymore. They were playing for the music, for the moment, for him. When the final movement began, Samuel closed his eyes for a second, remembering his wife's smile. The tiny apartment where he had once practiced in the dark, the broom that had replaced his baton, all the years of silence and regret, and now, a full orchestra breathing in rhythm with his heart. The last note came like a whisper, then vanished into silence. For a long, perfect moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself had paused. Samuel slowly lowered his baton, his chest rising and falling, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at the audience, their eyes wide, their mouths open, and thought maybe they didn't understand, maybe it hadn't worked. Then, one person stood and began to clap, then another, until the entire hall erupted into thunderous applause. People were on their feet, cheering, shouting, whistling. The sound echoed through the hall like a storm of joy. Tears rolled down Samuel's cheeks as he bowed deeply, overwhelmed by emotion. Even Leonard, standing in the shadows, couldn't look away. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by something else. Respect, and maybe a touch of shame. Mr. Hughes wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, whispering, "Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." The applause went on and on. Samuel looked around the stage. At Clara smiling through tears, at the musicians grinning proudly, at the shining lights above, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel invisible, he didn't feel small, he felt whole. When the curtain finally closed, the orchestra surrounded him. Clapping and laughing, Clara hugged him tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You showed them." Samuel smiled, his voice barely steady. "No," he said softly. "We did it, together." Outside, as the audience spilled out of the hall, the talk wasn't about Leonard or the gala's guests anymore. It was about the janitor who had played like a maestro. People whispered in awe. He made the music feel alive again, and in that moment, under the glowing lights of the hall he had cleaned for years, Samuel finally understood. Dreams don't die when the world forgets them. They wait quietly in the corners of our hearts until the music calls them back to life. The sound of applause still echoed in Samuel's mind long after the curtain fell. Even hours later, when the lights dimmed and the audience left, his heart was still racing, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from joy for the first time in his life. He had stood before a full hall, not as the man who swept the stage, but as the man who owned it. Backstage was chaos, reporters were waiting, musicians were crying and hugging, and Mr. Hughes, the manager, kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe what had just happened. "You did it, Samuel," he said, gripping his hand tightly. "You made history tonight." But Samuel only smiled humbly. "No, sir," he said quietly. "I just played my part." Clara ran up to him, her eyes red from tears. "I told you," she laughed through her smile. "I told you they'd stop laughing once they heard you." Samuel chuckled softly. "Maybe they didn't stop laughing," he said. "Maybe they just started listening." Her laugh turned into a small sob as she hugged him. "You changed us, Mr. Samuel," she whispered. "You reminded us why we fell in love with music in the first place." In one corner of the stage, Leonard stood silently watching everything. The man who once mocked Samuel now looked smaller. The confident smirk that had never left his face was gone. He approached slowly, his shoes clicking against the floor. Samuel turned to him and smiled. "Good evening, Mr. Leonard," he said warmly. Leonard hesitated, searching for words. "You were remarkable," he said finally. "I didn't expect—" Samuel raised a hand gently. "You don't need to explain," he said softly. "Music has a way of humbling all of us, doesn't it?" Leonard looked down, his pride wrestling with guilt. "I misjudged you," he admitted quietly. "I saw your broom, not your baton," Samuel smiled. "We all see what we want to see," he replied. "It's what we hear that truly matters." Leonard looked at him for a long moment, then offered his hand. Samuel shook it firmly, the audience's cheers still faintly audible from outside. "You deserve that applause," Leonard said sincerely, "not just for conducting, but for reminding us that music isn't a title, it's a truth." By the time Samuel left the concert hall, the night air was cool and crisp. The city shimmered under streetlights. He walked slowly down the quiet street, still half in disbelief. He had spent years sweeping these same paths, head down, invisible. Now strangers were calling his name. People passing by smiled and whispered, "That's him, the janitor maestro." It felt unreal, yet comforting. When he reached his small apartment, he placed the borrowed tuxedo carefully on the hanger and set the baton on the table. He stared at it for a long time, the simple stick of wood that had once been a dream, then a memory. And now, a key that unlocked everything he thought he had lost. He smiled softly and whispered to himself. She would have been proud, thinking of his late wife, who had once told him, "Music will never leave you, Samuel." Even when the world does, the next morning, the newspapers exploded with headlines. The janitor who conducted Heart, from mop to maestro. A night the city will never forget. There were photos of him bowing on stage, his eyes filled with tears. Journalists wanted interviews, schools wanted him to visit, orchestras wanted to meet him. His phone, which had been silent for years, wouldn't stop ringing. Mr. Hughes called him into his office that afternoon, grinning from ear to ear. "Samuel, my boy, we've had dozens of calls from the media," he said. "People want to know your story, and they want you to conduct again. Maybe even teach." Samuel blinked. "Teach?" he asked in surprise. "I've never thought about that." Hughes leaned forward. "You've got more to teach than most professors," he said. "You didn't just conduct music last night, you conducted souls." Samuel laughed quietly, rubbing his tired hands together. "Maybe," he said, "but I don't want fame. I just want to give back what music gave me." Hughes nodded. "Then do that," he said warmly. "Do it your way." Later that week, Samuel returned to the concert hall. Not as a janitor, but as a guest when he entered. The musicians stood and applauded him. Leonard himself handed him a bouquet of white lilies and said, "This is your stage as much as mine." Samuel smiled and said no. "This stage belongs to the music." He still helped the janitorial staff sometimes, out of habit, not duty. When people told him he didn't need to, he'd smile and say, "Old rhythms are hard to unlearn." Sometimes he'd walk past the empty hall late at night, pick up his baton and conduct the silence. Just for himself, one evening he saw a young boy peeking through the side door, holding a worn-out violin. "Can I listen?" the boy asked shyly. Samuel nodded. "Come in," he said kindly. "Music sounds better when it's shared." The boy sat down. Eyes wide with wonder, Samuel knelt beside him and said softly, "You don't need to be rich to make music, you just need to feel it here." He tapped his chest. "That's where it begins," the boy smiled. And for a moment Samuel saw a reflection of his younger self, full of dreams and untold stories. As he walked home that night, he realized something. The applause from the gala was unforgettable, but this quiet moment, helping another heart find its rhythm, meant even more. The next morning, the orchestra began rehearsing for their next concert. But things were different now. Leonard was gentler. The musicians played with more soul, and in the corner of the hall hung a small framed photo. Samuel, standing at the podium, baton raised high. The caption beneath it read, "Music belongs to everyone." And though the hall was filled with new faces and new melodies, one truth remained. Whenever someone picked up a broom or swept the floor in rhythm, the sound seemed to carry a strange, gentle harmony, like the echo of a man who once showed the world that greatness can rise from the humblest of places. Because that night the world didn't just witness music, it witnessed a miracle. The moment a janitor reminded everyone that dreams may sleep, but they never truly die. They just wait for the right song to wake them again. The weeks after the gala felt like living in a dream Samuel never dared to have. Strangers stopped him on the street just to shake his hand. People sent him letters calling him the maestro of the people, and schools invited him to speak about music and perseverance. But Samuel never let fame rest in his heart. Instead, he kept his same humble rhythm, sweeping his small apartment each morning, brewing tea and walking to the concert hall with quiet gratitude. Everywhere he went, people smiled at him. The janitor who turned into a conductor had become a living legend. Yet Samuel didn't care for headlines or spotlights. His heart still beat for the same thing it always had: music, the one language that never judged him, never laughed at him, and never left. One morning, as he walked into the concert hall, the place that had once been only a workplace now felt like home. He noticed a new sign outside the entrance: the Samuel Reed Orchestra Hall. In honor of the maestro who taught us to listen. He stopped in disbelief. His throat tightening, Clara stood behind him smiling. "You deserve it," she said. "The manager wanted to surprise you." Samuel shook his head with a soft laugh. "It's too much," he said. "I'm just a janitor who got lucky." Clara frowned playfully. "You're not just anything," she said. "You're proof that music isn't about who you are. It's about what's inside you." He smiled at her. "And you're proof that faith can change a man's life," and he replied. Inside the hall, the orchestra was rehearsing. But something was different. Leonard stood aside, letting a group of young musicians take the lead. Samuel recognized a few of them from the school he had visited earlier that month. They were nervous, their hands trembling as they tuned their instruments. Leonard turned and waved at Samuel. "You're just in time," he said. "We were waiting for our guest of honor." The musicians looked up, eyes widening in excitement. One of them whispered, "That's him," another said, "the janitor maestro." Samuel raised a hand modestly. "Please, just Samuel," he said with a smile. Leonard gestured toward the podium. "Would you do us the honor?" Samuel hesitated, but then nodded. He stepped onto the stage once more, his steps slow, familiar, and filled with meaning. When he lifted the baton, the same old calm washed over him. He felt at home again. "All right," he said softly. "Let's play something simple, but play it like it's the only song left in the world." The young musicians followed his lead, and soon the hall filled with warmth. The music flowed beautifully, full of small imperfections but overflowing with heart. Samuel smiled as he guided them, his movements gentle, precise, and patient. He didn't correct their mistakes harshly. He taught them how to feel instead of just play, and that made all the difference. After the session, one shy student approached him, holding her violin tightly. "Mr. Samuel," she said softly, "I want to be like you." But my parents say I'll never make it in music. They say I should focus on a real job. Samuel looked at her kindly. Do you know what my first real job was? He asked. She shook her head. Mopping floors, he said with a smile, and yet, that job led me right back here sometimes. Life looks like it's closing doors, but really, it's guiding you toward the one that matters. The girl smiled shyly and nodded. Clutching her violin as if it suddenly meant more than ever before, Samuel patted her shoulder gently. Don't chase fame, he said. Chase feeling. That's what music truly is. That evening, Samuel sat alone in the empty hall, the lights dimmed. The echo of the young orchestra still hung in the air. He looked at the conductor's stand and smiled. You and I have been through a lot, he whispered to the stage. But I think it's time to share the music with others now. He took a piece of paper from his coat pocket, his handwritten letter of retirement. He had decided that it was time to step back. Not because he was tired, but because he wanted others to take the spotlight. He wanted to guide from behind the scenes, to help others discover what he had. The beauty in sound, the peace in purpose. The next day, when he handed the letter to Mr. Hughes, the manager frowned. Are you sure? He asked. People still want to see you conduct? Samuel smiled gently. Let them see others, he said. I've had my moment. Now it's time to make sure more people find theirs, Clara. Upon hearing the news, protested, You can't just stop, Mr. Samuel. She said, You belong on that stage. Samuel laughed softly. No, Clara, he said. I belong to the music, and the music belongs to everyone. He spent his final weeks at the hall mentoring young students, teaching them how to listen to silence, how to breathe between notes, and how to trust their hearts. His calm voice, his gentle patience, and his deep love for sound made him more than a teacher. He became a legend who lived among them. On his last evening after everyone left, Samuel stood alone one final time on the stage. He lifted his baton, the air still and waiting. He closed his eyes and imagined the orchestra, his orchestra, playing one last time. He moved his hands slowly, gracefully conducting the invisible, the echoes of every rehearsal, every note. Every memory filled the hall like a ghostly symphony. When the final invisible note ended, he smiled and whispered, Thank you. Setting the baton down gently on the stand, he turned and walked away, not as the janitor, not as the maestro, but as a man who had lived his dream fully. Months later, the hall continued to thrive. Young musicians performed under his name, and visitors often stopped at a small plaque near the entrance, engraved with his favorite words, Talent can live anywhere, even in a broom closet. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the lights were low and the hall was empty, some said they could still hear faint music, the soft rhythm of a broom sweeping in time, and the whisper of a baton moving through air, reminding everyone that true greatness never needs applause, it only needs heart.